Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive with us.
Always exciting to be here.
Today we're going to be digging into some pretty thought-provoking stuff about the realities of modern capitalism.
I think this will be a good one.
Yeah, I think so too. The ideas we're looking at come from economist Grace Blakeley.
Oh yeah, I've heard her on a few podcasts.
She's definitely got a lot to say, and we've got excerpts from a few interviews she's done, plus a review of her book, Vulture Capitalism.
Interesting.
And even like a super detailed summary of the book itself. So we're going to try to piece all of that together and see if we can challenge some of those traditional assumptions about how capitalism actually works.
Sounds like a plan.
So to kick things off, one of the things that really struck me about Blakely's work is how she goes right at this whole free market idea. You know, like that whole idea of the state versus the market.
Right, like they're two separate things.
Exactly. And she basically says, nope, that's not how it works at all.
Yeah, she's really arguing that a truly free market, a market operating without any involvement from the state, it's a myth.
But it's a myth we hear all the time.
All the time.
So how does she back that up?
Well, she starts by pointing out that any market to function, it needs certain things. Like you need infrastructure, you need a legal system, you need a stable currency, right? And those are all things that are provided by the state.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So if the state is already involved in creating and maintaining the conditions for the market to exist, then how can we even talk about a market that's free from the state?
So the question becomes not should the state be involved, but like how should it be involved?
Right, exactly. And to get at that, Blakeley actually brings up the work of Hayek.
Okay, I know Hayek, he was a big proponent of free markets, wasn't he?
He was, but Blakeley points out that even Hayek believed in a kind of double truth when it came to capitalism. He argued that this simplified free market narrative, leave it all to the market, that was for the masses.
But behind closed doors.
Behind closed doors, the elites, they understood that they needed to shape and control the system to make it work in their favor.
Okay, so it's like one story for the public and another one for the people in power.
That's what Blakeley is suggesting. And her point is that this gap between the simplified story and the complex reality has a real impact on our lives, on our economic decisions.
Okay, I'm starting to see where this is going.
Yeah.
So how does this double truth actually play out in our everyday lives?
Well, think about how we talk about economic policy.
Okay.
We hear so much about letting the market decide or getting the government out of the way, right?
Yeah.
But if we acknowledge that the state is always involved in shaping the market,
Always.
then the question becomes not should the state intervene, but how should it intervene and in whose interests?
Okay, that completely reframes the whole debate over government and the economy.
It does. It's not free markets versus government control. It's about recognizing that the market is always shaped by political choices.
And that leads us right into another key part of Blakely's analysis, the rise of neoliberalism and what that's meant for corporate power.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and in the excerpts we've got, she talks a lot about figures like Thatcher and Reagan.
Those are big names in the neoliberal movement for sure.
They were all about shrinking the state, letting the free market rule. But I have a feeling it didn't quite work out that way.
Yeah, you're right. The neoliberal shift of the 1980s, it promised to unleash the power of free markets. But what we actually saw was a lot of the state's power being redirected to serve corporate interests.
And often at the expense of workers and the public good.
Exactly.
So what did this power shift actually look like in practice?
Well, one of the clearest examples is the decline of labor unions.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Unions were seen as interfering with the free market, so they were weakened. And as unions lost, power workers lost a lot of their bargaining power.
Wages stagnated, working conditions declined for a lot of people.
Right. And it created a more favorable environment for corporations to prioritize profits above pretty much everything else.
Things like environmental protection, social responsibility, all took a backseat.
Yeah, that's a key part of Blakeley's argument. She's saying that this neoliberal ideology, while claiming to be about individual freedom, it actually ended up empowering corporations.
And concentrating wealth and power at the top.
Exactly.
So it's like this whole system is rigged in a way.
Well, that's a big part of what Blakeley is trying to expose. She's saying that this system isn't about free markets and individual opportunity. It's about power and who benefits from it.
So if that's the case, where do we go from here? What's the next step in understanding this system?
Well, Blakeley doesn't just offer critique. She also points to some pretty dramatic examples of how this system plays out in the real world. And one of the most striking is the story of the Boeing 737 MAX crashes.
Oh, man. Yeah, that was a tragedy. That whole story about Boeing cutting corners on safety, prioritizing profits over people's lives, it was horrifying.
It was, and Blakely uses this case as a microcosm of what she calls vulture capitalism in action.
Okay, so let's dive into that Boeing case and see how it connects to this bigger picture of vulture capitalism.
Sounds good to me. Yeah, so the Boeing 737 MAX crashes. I mean, it's a really clear example of how corporate priorities can just completely clash with public safety.
Yeah, for sure. And in this case, Boeing was under a ton of pressure, right, to compete with Airbus to deliver this new fuel-efficient plane, and they had to do it quickly and cheaply.
Exactly. And Blakely argues that in that pursuit of, maximizing profits, they ended up cutting corners on safety features. They rushed the development and certification process for the 737 MAX.
And wasn't there even something about them lobbying to weaken regulatory oversight?
Yeah, absolutely. They actually lobbied to weaken the regulations so they could essentially self-certify some aspects of the plane's design.
Wow, it's kind of mind-blowing that a company could have that much influence over the regulatory process.
So what about the FAA? Weren't they supposed to be ensuring the safety of these planes?
Well, this is where this idea of regulatory capture comes in. Blakely highlights how these close ties between Boeing and the FAA, they have this revolving door of personnel between the two, right? People going back and forth between the company and the agency.
Exactly. And it created the situation where the regulator was essentially captured by the industry it was supposed to be overseeing.
So instead of acting as a watchdog, the FAA was more like a lapdog, just letting Boeing get away with things that put profits ahead of people's lives.
Yeah, that's a pretty harsh assessment, but I think it's accurate in this case. And the consequences, as we know, were tragic.
It's a chilling example of how concentrated power, whether it's corporate or governmental, can just lead to this disregard for the well-being of ordinary people. It makes you wonder if this kind of thing is more common than we realize.
I think Blakely would argue that it is. And she uses the Boeing case as just one really dramatic illustration of a broader trend she identifies, the financialization of the economy.
Okay, I've heard that term before, but I'm not sure I totally get it. Can you explain what financialization means and how it connects to this whole picture of vulture capitalism?
Sure. So essentially, financialization refers to the increasing dominance of financial institutions and financial markets in the economy. It's about how financial motives and metrics, things like shareholder value and short-term profits, they've come to dominate decision-making in businesses and even in government.
So it's not just about Wall Street anymore.
No, it's this financial mindset that's kind of permeated almost every aspect of our lives.
And one of the consequences of that is?
And one of the key consequences, according to Blakely, is the concentration of economic power in the hands of a few massive asset management firms.
Like BlackRock.
Yeah, BlackRock's a prime example. They manage trillions of dollars in assets. They have stakes in pretty much every major corporation.
I remember reading about them in the materials you sent. Yeah, they're huge.
They're massive. And that gives them an enormous amount of power over the companies they invest in. They can pressure companies to prioritize short-term profits over long-term investments, to cut costs, even to influence their political lobbying efforts.
So they're kind of like pulling the strings of the economy from behind the scenes, dictating how companies operate, even shaping government policy. It doesn't sound much like the free market competition we always hear about.
Exactly. And that's precisely Blakely's point. This concentration of power in the hands of a few financial giants, it undermines the supposed efficiency and fairness of the market. It creates a system where a select few can dictate the terms of the game, often to the detriment of workers, consumers, even the long-term health of the economy itself.
This is all starting to feel a bit overwhelming. We've gone from this flawed idea of the free market to the rise of neoliberalism, from corporate greed in the Boeing case to the shadowy power of financial institutions like BlackRock. Is there any way out of this system?
Well, Blakely argues that we need to fundamentally rethink our relationship with the economy, rediscover the power of collective action.
Okay.
She believes that real change isn't going to come from just tweaking the existing system. It's about challenging the underlying assumptions and creating a more democratic and equitable model.
That sounds promising. But how do we actually do that? Where do we even begin to dismantle this system of vulture capitalism?
Blakely points to some inspiring examples of resistance and alternative models from around the world. She highlights things like worker cooperatives, community-owned enterprises, and movements pushing for democratic control of finance and technology.
I mean, those are interesting examples, but they often feel small and isolated compared to the scale of the problems we're facing. Can these alternative models really make a dent in a system as entrenched as vulture capitalism?
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to feel that way. Like, it's this massive system, and how can we possibly challenge it? But Blakely's point is that These institutions, they rely on our cooperation. They rely on us accepting the rules of the game.
It's just like they need us to play along.
In a way, yeah. And that's where the potential for change lies, in recognizing our collective power and finding ways to change those rules.
Okay, so let's talk about those alternative models she mentions. Like, what are some examples of people actually pushing back against this system and creating something different?
One area where there's a lot of interesting stuff happening is with worker cooperatives.
Worker co-ops. Yeah, I've heard of those.
So these are businesses that are owned and democratically controlled by the workers themselves.
So instead of having a CEO and a board of directors making all the decisions?
Right. It's the workers who have the power. They decide how the business is run, how profits are shared. It's a way to move beyond that traditional corporate model where profits are just extracted by a small group of owners or shareholders.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've heard about some successful worker co-ops, but they often seem to exist kind of on the margins of the economy. Can this model really be scaled up to challenge those big corporations?
It's a good question. And Blakeley would say that we need to shift our thinking about scale. It's not necessarily about creating one giant worker co-op to take on Amazon or something. It's more about building a diverse and resilient economy where worker ownership and democratic control are more widespread.
So it's about spreading that model as far and wide as possible.
Exactly. Creating a system where power is more evenly distributed, where workers have a real say in how their workplaces are run and how the benefits of their labor are shared.
And it's not just about worker co-ops, right?
Right.
There are other models out there too.
Right. We see examples of community-owned enterprises where local communities take control of key resources or businesses, making sure they serve the needs of the community rather than just the interests of outside investors.
Yeah, like that example from the book summary about the Welsh town of Blaenau-Festiniog.
Exactly. The community came together to create this network of locally owned businesses. It's a really inspiring example of how people can reclaim control over their economic destinies.
It's amazing what can happen when people come together like that.
It is, and these examples show that alternatives are possible even within the constraints of the current system. And a lot of times they come from the grassroots, people who are just tired of being exploited and want to create a more just and equitable way of doing things.
But these alternative models, they often face an uphill battle, right? They have to compete with these giant corporations that have so much money, so much political influence. How can they possibly succeed?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. But Blakeley argues that change often starts small and builds momentum over time. She points to historical examples like the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the environmental movement. All of these movements faced powerful opposition, but they achieved incredible progress through organizing and collective action.
So it's not about waiting for some magical solution or hoping that some benevolent billionaire is going to come save the day.
Right. It's about people taking action, demanding change, building the kind of world they want to see.
And that can feel daunting, but it's also empowering in a way.
Definitely. And remember, even small actions can have a ripple effect. Supporting worker co-ops, buying from locally owned businesses, advocating for policies that promote economic democracy, all of these things chip away at the foundations of that system.
The system of vulture capitalism.
Exactly. And they help build a more just and sustainable alternative.
I'm really starting to see how Blakeley's analysis goes beyond just critique. It's also a call to action. It's about recognizing our own agency, even in the face of this seemingly all-powerful system.
That's a great way to put it. And I think that's a key takeaway from this whole deep dive. Blakeley doesn't offer easy answers or a step-by-step guide to revolution. But she challenges us to think critically about the system we live in, to question the assumptions we often take for granted, and to find our own ways to engage in the struggle for a better world.
It's been a really fascinating conversation exploring these ideas with you. We've covered a lot of ground. From dissecting that myth of the free market to uncovering the hidden mechanisms of vulture capitalism, from the devastating consequences of corporate greed to the inspiring potential of those alternative models.
Absolutely. And hopefully this deep dive has given everyone listening some new insights and maybe even sparked some ideas about how they can get involved in building a more just and equitable economic future.
Yeah, if you're feeling inspired to learn more, definitely check out Grace Blakeley's book, Vulture Capitalism. And we'll also be sharing some additional resources on our website.
It's all about learning more and getting involved.
Exactly. Remember, change starts with each of us.
Right.
By recognizing our collective power and taking action even in small ways, we can start to dismantle this system of vulture capitalism and create a world where the economy works for everyone, not just a privileged few.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep pushing for a better world.